My name is Elizabeth Carlile. Let me tell you the story of the Carlile family coming from England to America. In the 1820s, my Carlile and Williamson grandparents all were living the village of Misson in Nottinghamshire, England. Misson is a well-built village, on the north side of the River Idle in Nottinghamshire, England. It is located 12 miles north of Retford, and not directly accessible from the rest of Nottinghamshire. Nottingham is the legendary home of Robin Hood. The Sherwood Forest is 22 miles south of where they lived. My parents were married here. The Misson Parish Church is named St. John the Baptist. It was rebuilt after extensive damage in 1894. The church is a handsome building, with a nave, chancel, side aisles and a tower. My Carlile grandparents are Robert Carlile and Christina Spouncer. They had 7 children, Mary, Isaac, John, James, Robert, and George. Their first son John died young, so they named their next son John as well. Robert Jr. also died very young. Here is the Carlile census of 1841 when my father was 16 years old. It says they lived on High Street. 4 of their children were living with them, including my father John, who is listed as a male laborer. Here is my mother's 1841 census on Mission Common Lane. She is listed as a female laborer working for an older couple named George and Mary Burton. On January 21, 1845, my parents' marriage was solemnized. It states my mother was of full age and was a spinster, meaning a woman who has never been married. My father is listed as a bachelor. Their social ranks are listed as servants. They both signed it with the mark X. Francis Williamson is listed as my grandfather. My father John was a lover of horses and was always able to get work because of them. He was a farmer, but owned no land. His father encouraged him to be a tiller of the soil. They had 3 children while in England, Sarah, George, and Christina. Orson Pratt was a missionary leader in England. He was called to preach the gospel and oversee the emigration of the saints to America. When Elder Pratt spoke, the Spirit immediately bore witness to Grandmother Christina of the divinity of the Restoration movement. The gift of tongues fell on her and she had to place her hand over her mouth to keep from speaking out in the services. Grandfather Robert said he had led a wicked life before baptism. They made preparation to move to America where they could be with the main body of the church. All the Carlile family left to Liverpool except Aunt Mary Cooper and my oldest sister Sarah, who was only 5 years old. It was hard for my parents to leave my young sister behind. They boarded the ship Zetland in Liverpool, making its second voyage. It sailed November 10, 1849 with 250 saints. It was at sea for 44 days. Here is the board registry. It landed on Christmas Eve in New Orleans. From New Orleans, they took a steamboat up north and arrived to St. Louis. They eventually made it to Iowa in Canesville, which is now Council Bluffs. They stayed in Canesville for 2 years. They were all able to get work in Council Bluffs and they remained there until the spring of 1852, during which time they had gathered together food and supplies for their long trip to Utah. Here is the 1850 census for John and Elizabeth Carlile. My sister Mary was born while living in Iowa. They pioneered to Utah with the Henry Bryant Manning Jolly Company of 1852, which consisted of 340 individuals and about 64 wagons. They had been able to get their own wagons, oxen and teams of cows so that they were independent, and did not have to ask help from the church. They relied on their cows' milk for food. It took about 5 months until they reached Provo. They are recorded in the Provo 2nd Ward in 1852. I was born on January 22, 1853 in Provo just before we moved. We soon moved to Palmyra, which later changed its name to Spanish Fork. My parents had 3 children while in Utah. Myself, John, and Emma. They had 7 children in total, 3 born in England, 1 in Iowa, and 3 in Utah. Grasshoppers destroyed our crops. Food was so scarce we lived on roots and very little bran bread. We faced the possibility of starving to death because we had had 2 years of crop failure on account of the grasshoppers. It took a lot of faith, but the Lord did bless us. The Walker War broke out between the Indians and the settlers. After the first attack, the small settlements were broken up and they sought refuge in a fort in Spanish Fork. One day an Indian came to the Carlile home, where he found Mother alone. He drew a large knife and aimed it at her throat. Just then a neighbor came in and yelled and Mother got away. Uncle George fought in the Walker War. The older brother George, at 11 years old, went swimming on Sunday with the other boys, while my folks were in meeting. He went under the water and though help was summoned they couldn't find the body for some length of time. George died by drowning. This caused us great sorrow. On April 30, 1859 my father John, with his brothers James and George Carlile, with Thomas Rasband, Charles Carroll, William Giles and others with 3 wagons and oxen for teams, left Provo and went through Provo Canyon into Heber Valley. The first night after leaving Provo, these pioneers encountered a snow avalanche on the Provo River. It was impossible for them to get over it that night, so they camped. They were the first white settlers to enter the Heber Valley. These men tilled and planted crops. After some time my father was low on provisions and felt he needed to make a trip back home to check on us. He left early in the morning, so as to reach home and his family that night. About 10 miles into his journey he had to cross the Provo River on horseback in the high, fast-moving water. Between the struggling of his horse and the perilous effort to keep together, John was kicked in the chest by his horse. The horse made it to the other side of the river and got out on the bank and stood by the river. John, however, was not out of the water yet, but was hanging on to some branches. He was really hurt. On July 24, 1859 the family moved to the Heber Valley. It rained very hard as we were going through the canyon, damaging our flour and supplies. After arriving at the little home we had a very difficult time. Father was suffering from the injury to his chest and not getting any better, so Mother had to assume all the responsibility. In September Father died at 34. He was the first man buried in the Heber Cemetery. A 60-acre farm had been established that spring and was left for us to operate as best we could. Although some of the settlers returned to Provo, we decided to stay the winter in the valley. Along with the others, we suffered from cold and hunger. My baby sister Emma died that winter. My mother Elizabeth Williamson Carlile was left with 4 children to provide for. Heber Fort was built for our protection. It was a simple structure of cottonwood logs. Log cabins were built inside the fortress using that common wall. The structure provided security and safety for us as we put down roots and worshipped the Lord. My sister Christina was baptized on a winter day. She walked home in wet clothes. They were frozen by the time they got home, but she was never happier in her life. My grandparents Robert and Christina moved to Heber a year later, but grandfather died the next year. My mother was kind and considerate. She provided a room in her home for a young boy named Mark Jeffs and his blind father Richard. This helped financially. My sister, Mary, ended up marrying Mark Jeffs when he was 18 and she was just about to turn 14 years old. They started a trading business from their home. In the 1860s the Union Pacific Railroad entered Utah and most of the men in the county found work in Echo and Weber canyons. During the another grasshopper famine my mother went to Echo Canyon to cook for a company of Heber men who were working on the railroad. In this way she provided food for herself and family during the hard times that followed. My mother was an industrious and hard-working woman, not so much in making her home attractive, but in gleaning wheat, and saving everything possible to support her family. She was forced to glean wheat, gather hops, ground cherries to feed children. She also loved knitting socks. In 1872 my mother took another job. She worked at the Pinyon Mine Company near Park City, cooking for the miners. She was working to get extra money to help Sarah come to America from England. Sarah's husband had just passed away. She really missed my oldest sister who was left behind when they immigrated to America. My mother paid for Sarah and her 3 young children to come to Heber. Mother experienced anxiety and nervousness as we waited Sarah's arrival. Mother felt immense joy and relief in finally reuniting with her long-lost daughter. The moment of seeing her child after such a long separation was emotionally overwhelming. The next year Sarah died and left her 3 young children in the care of my mother. Mother was happy she got to see her daughter before she died. My mother continued to raise the Sarah Eastman children after her death. She raised them like her own. You can see Mary, Emma, and Arom living with her in the 1880 census. To recap on all my aunts and uncles, let me show you their family charts. Mary Carlile married Joseph Cooper and had 7 children. They remained in England and didn't come with the family. My uncle Isaac Carlile did come to America. He came briefly to Utah, but returned back to Iowa for the fertile soil for farming. His family joined the RLDS Church. My uncle James Carlile married Emily Giles and had 6 children. He was one of the original founders of Heber like my father and was a successful farmer. My uncle George Lyle married Laura Giles. They had 7 children. He was an Indian War veteran. He also was one of the founding fathers of Heber. 2 of my uncles married into the Giles family. My parents had 7 children: Sarah, George, Christina, Mary, myself, John, and Emma. Both uncles James and George helped my family after my father died. The places we lived in Utah are seen in this map. We started in Provo where I was born. Then moved to Spanish Fork, then eventually settled in Heber, where we remained the rest of our lives. I married John Nelson Carroll, in Provo on Valentine's Day in 1872. He had been a miner, but planned on living on the range, raising cattle. John ran a business in Wasatch County. He herded stock on the range and would be gone weeks at a time. We had 10 children from 1873 to 1895. Esther, Elizabeth, Susan, John, Emily, George, Krista, Earl, Mary, and Tressa. I loved being a mother and raising my children. I went by Lizzie according to this photo. Going to the temple was a special occasion. Here is an article about a group of 20 of us going to the Logan Temple. We went to do temple work and attend a wedding. My husband did not go. For a number of years my grandmother Christiana Carlile lived alone in her little home, and as she was a very kind and friendly little lady. She was often seen walking over the stubble ground on her bare feet with her shoes under her arm. When she came to the road she would put on her shoes. In this way she would save her shoes, since money were very scarce. She became blind, and when she could no longer care for her little home she went to live with her son James. She was known as Blind Grandma. Later she went to live with her son George. Grandmother always thanked the helpers. She got comfort from her cats. She sat on her east porch most of the time and spoke very few words. She wore a cap in the house and a bonnet out of the house. She would tell me, "Come here, honey, and let me measure you. I am your grandma." She would put her hand on my head to see how tall I was. On Thanksgiving Day 1891, grandmother requested that all near relatives come to the house for dinner and insisted that they set the table in the room where she lay in bed, for she said, "I want to know that you are all getting a good dinner." It was a very memorable last dinner with her. She passed away within a week of the Thanksgiving feast. She was laid beside her husband in the Heber City Cemetery. She died at 95 years old and was the oldest person in Wasatch County. 2 years later my mother passed away too. She was an industrious, hard-working woman who did everything possible to support her family. I will always remember my noble pioneer mother. In the 1890s Heber experienced an expansion of infrastructure to accommodate the growing population. All my children were born by 1895. Here is a photo of Uncle James and his family. In June 1902 my husband John Nelson Carroll died at 59. He was born in New Brunswick, Canada, and lived a good life. Some said he was quite a fleshy man. At the funeral my brother John Carlile Jr. was carrying the casket when the casket began to come apart. In trying to keep the body from dropping to the ground, he was injured internally and 2 weeks to that day he was buried as a result of this injury. I was sad to see my husband and brother die so close together. I continued as a single mother. I was living on 2nd Street Northeast in Heber. I did advertisements for Doan's kidney pills that you could buy at Heber Drug Company store. They gave me prompt relief from the pains in my back and shoulders. For many years I had been a teacher in the Relief Society organization of the Heber First Ward. I always could be found in the line of duty. When the end came, all my sons and daughters were at my bedside. I died on June 5, 1927 in Heber, Utah. I was a widow for 25 years. I am Elizabeth Carlile Carroll. My parents were raised in Nottinghamshire, England. After joining the church, they immigrated to Utah. They pioneered to become some of the first settlers of Heber. Thank you for listening to my Carlile family story.